A retired U.S. Marine stood alone in the frozen streets of Duluth as a 10-year-old German shepherd pressed close to his leg, growling at a smell that did not belong to the winter. Behind the walls of a house no one wanted, something had been sealed away for decades. Bones, gold, and a crime the cold had failed to erase. He could have walked away. He could have kept the secret and lived easier. Instead, one choice would test everything war had taught him about honor, loyalty, and what it truly means to finish a mission. What follows will shake you and quietly restore your faith. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Winter arrived in Duluth like a verdict, heavy clouds pressing low over frozen streets as wind slid off Lake Superior and cut through everything it touched. Robert Miller stood beside his truck, breath visible in short, controlled bursts, the kind learned long ago when panic could get a man killed. 65 years old, recently retired from the United States Marine Corps, Robert was still broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, his posture straight out of habit rather than pride. His face was deeply lined, not soft with age but sharpened by years of discipline and restraint. A squared jaw carried a short salt and pepper beard trimmed close, more from routine than vanity. His hands were large, scarred, the skin hardened and cracked, fingers permanently curved as if they still expected weight or recoil. War had taken many things from Robert, but it had never managed to take his structure. At his left side stood Max. Max was a 10-year-old German shepherd, tall and once powerful, now slower, the black and tan fur around his muzzle turning gray. His back legs trembled slightly in the cold, not from fear but from age and long service beside a man who rarely rested. One ear no longer stood fully upright, folding at the tip from an old injury. His eyes, however, were unchanged. Deep brown, steady, alert. Max still walked on Robert's left without command, matching his pace the way he had done for years, a habit forged not through training manuals, but through shared silence and survival. Robert looked at the house. It sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a tired structure with peeling paint and a roof sagging just enough to suggest neglect rather than collapse. Snow had gathered in uneven drifts along the foundation. The windows were intact but dull, as if the glass itself had grown weary of looking outward. This was not a house meant to impress anyone. It was a house meant to endure. Robert had bought it cheaply, not as an investment, not as a gamble. He did not believe in luck anymore. He believed in preparation, containment, and knowing exactly what ground you stood on. After decades of moving where orders sent him, this house represented something unfamiliar and unsettling. Permanence. Inside, the cold was immediate. The heater worked, but weakly, struggling against the lake wind that pressed through old walls and narrow seams. Robert moved room to room with deliberate steps, mapping space automatically. Entry points, corners, stair angles. The basement door caught his attention, as doors always did, but he passed it for now. Max followed, nails clicking softly on the worn wood floor. The dog paused once, inhaling deeply, then continued. Nothing urgent. Nothing yet. Later that afternoon, as snow began falling again, Robert met Helen Carter. She was standing outside the small church down the street, stacking donated food boxes into the back of an old van. 55 years old, Helen was medium height, with a lean, athletic frame that suggested strength maintained rather than inherited. Her hair was light brown, threaded with gray, pulled back into a low, practical ponytail that exposed a calm, weathered face. Her skin was pale from winter, lightly freckled, and her eyes were a clear, steady blue that assessed before they judged. She wore a thick utility coat, faded army green, gloves with worn fingertips, and boots built for long days rather than style. Helen noticed Robert before he spoke. Veterans often did. She straightened, gave a short nod, not a smile, not yet. When she spoke, her voice was firm, level, without softness or hostility. "You the new one on Maple Street?" Robert nodded once. "Just moved in." Helen glanced at Max, her gaze lingering not with curiosity but recognition. "He's old," she said gently. "So am I," Robert replied. That earned him a brief smile. Not warm, respectful. Helen Carter was a former Army logistics officer. She did not say it out loud. She did not need to. Her posture said enough. The way she stood balanced, ready to move. The way her hands never fidgeted. She had served, lost her husband to complications tied to his own service years after the war ended, and stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because Duluth had become a place where forgotten people quietly collected. She volunteered at the church, helped veterans file paperwork, drove them to appointments, listened more than she spoke. "Cold house," she said, nodding toward Robert's place. "Basement floods in spring. Heaters weak. Pipes freeze if you're careless." Robert absorbed the information without reaction. "Appreciate the warning." Helen studied him for a moment longer. She saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned even in calm conversation. She recognized the weight of a man who had finished serving others and had not yet learned how to stop. "If you need help," she said, "ask early. Waiting too long is how people get hurt." Then she turned back to her work. That night, Robert sat alone in the house. Max lying near his boots. Wind rattled the windows. The heater clicked and paused. Clicked again. Robert removed his jacket slowly, folded it with care, and set it aside. He stared at the wall across from him, not really seeing it. Retirement had been explained to him as rest. But rest, Robert had learned, required a different kind of strength. There were no orders now. No structure imposed from outside. No mission except the one he would have to define himself. Max shifted, letting out a low, tired breath. Robert reached down, resting his hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath thinning fur. "We're home," he said quietly, testing the words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks, smoothing rough edges, hiding what lay beneath. Robert did not believe in clean beginnings. He believed in honest ones, and this house, cold and imperfect, felt honest. The basement door creaked slightly as the wind pushed against it. Robert noticed. He always noticed, but he stayed where he was. Some things could wait. Late January loosened winter's grip just enough to expose what the cold had been hiding. Snow receded from the edges of Robert Miller's yard in uneven patches, revealing dark soil and old concrete like scars resurfacing after years of cover. The air inside the house still carried winter, but something else lingered beneath it, subtle and unsettling. Robert descended the basement stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding a flashlight. The steps creaked with age, not dangerously, but enough to demand attention. He moved with the same caution he had learned decades earlier, weight distributed evenly, breathing controlled. Behind him came Max. The German shepherd no longer bounded down steps. At 10 years old, his movements were deliberate, careful, but his presence filled the narrow stairwell. His black and tan coat was duller than it had once been, gray spreading along his neck and muzzle. His eyes, however, remained sharp, tracking shadows and corners with quiet authority, The basement smelled wrong. It was not the familiar odor of damp stone or old wood. This was heavier, sour beneath the must, something trapped without air for far too long. Max stopped halfway down the stairs and let out a low, restrained growl. Not loud, not aggressive, but insistent. His body stiffened, tail still, ears forward. Robert stopped immediately. Years earlier, in places far from Minnesota, that sound had meant danger before sight ever confirmed it. He trusted it now as he had then. He swept the flashlight beam slowly across the basement. Stone walls, old shelving, rusted tools left by someone who had never returned. Then the beam lingered. One wall looked different, not broken, not cracked, simply wrong. The stones were the same shape and size as the rest, but the mortar between them was lighter, cleaner, less worn. Time had touched everything else down here, but not that section. Robert stepped closer, heart steady but alert. He tapped the wall lightly with his knuckles. The sound came back hollow. Max moved to Robert's side, pressing close, his shoulder brushing the man's leg. The dog's breathing was shallow now, controlled, ready. Robert fetched a small pry bar from his toolbox upstairs. He worked carefully, removing stone by stone, methodical, patient. Each movement was deliberate. No panic. Panic wasted energy. After several minutes, a gap opened. Cold air rushed from within, carrying that same heavy odor, stronger now. The space behind the wall was small, no larger than a storage closet. The flashlight revealed metal containers stacked neatly against one side. Old industrial crates, dented, stained, their surfaces dull with age. In the far corner lay something else. Bones, human. Partial remains, arranged not by ceremony but by necessity. The wrists were positioned unnaturally close together. Rusted metal cuffs still encircled them. Robert did not speak. He did not step back. He simply stood there, absorbing the scene, his chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. He had seen death many times, on battlefields, in hospitals, in quiet moments that never made it into reports. This was not fresh. This was history buried and forgotten. Max whined softly, a sound rarely heard from him, and leaned his weight into Robert's leg. Robert rested his hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. "This isn't ours," Robert said aloud, his voice low, steady. Saying it mattered. Naming the truth mattered. He sealed the wall as best he could for the moment, and left the basement without another glance. Upstairs, the house felt colder than before, though the heater clicked on just as it always had. Robert washed his hands at the sink longer than necessary. The water ran clear. His thoughts did not. That evening, as darkness fell early and snow returned lightly, Robert walked the short distance to Helen Carter's house. Her porch light was already on. She opened the door before he knocked fully, as if she had expected him. Helen wore a thick sweater and work pants, her hair still pulled back, face bare of makeup, eyes sharp but calm. She took one look at Robert and stepped aside, letting him in without a word. "I found something in the basement," Robert said once the door was closed. He stood straight, hands at his sides, like he was reporting to a superior officer. Helen did not rush him. She poured coffee, set a mug in front of him, then waited. "It's old," he continued. "Not an accident. Someone hid it. Someone didn't leave alive." Helen's jaw tightened slightly. She nodded once. "Did you touch anything you shouldn't have?" "Only enough to know what it was." She studied him closely, searching his face. Helen had learned long ago that men like Robert did not exaggerate. When they spoke, it was because silence had become heavier than words. "You know what comes next," she said quietly. Robert nodded. He did know. Reporting it would bring questions, investigators, disruption. The house would no longer be quiet. His clean break into retirement would fracture immediately. Max shifted at Robert's feet, laying his head across Robert's boots. "I didn't come back from war to start lying now," Robert said. Helen placed her hand briefly on the table between them. It was not a comforting gesture. It was acknowledgement. "You're not alone," she said. "But once you call this in, it won't be yours anymore. Not the house. Not the quiet." "I don't need quiet," Robert replied. "I need to be able to sleep." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, wind pushed snow against the windows, filling the night with a soft, relentless sound. When Robert left, Helen stood in the doorway watching him walk back into the dark, Max pacing faithfully beside him. She knew the look of a man stepping onto a difficult path because it was the right one. She had walked it herself. Back home, Robert stood at the top of the basement stairs, hand resting on the door. He did not go down again. He did not need to. What was there would wait. He picked up the phone. The house did not sleep after Robert Miller made the call. It stood awake, lights on, walls listening, as if the truth moving through it had weight. By morning, 2 vehicles were parked outside, dark and unmarked, their engines ticking softly in the cold. Snow continued to fall, thin and steady, erasing yesterday while making room for consequences. Robert waited inside with Max at his feet. He had shaved that morning, the ritual calming, the blade steady in his hand. The mirror showed him the same man it always had, angular face, tired eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow, a short gray beard outlining a jaw that had learned to hold its shape through loss. If fear was present, it stayed where it belonged, under control. Fear did not get to lead. The first to enter was Sheriff Daniel Crow, a local man in his late 50s with a thick neck, weathered skin, and a mustache gone almost entirely white. Crow had grown up in Duluth, knew every street, every family story, and carried himself with the quiet patience of someone who had seen enough tragedy to stop dramatizing it. His uniform was worn but clean, his boots tracked in snow and salt. He shook Robert's hand firmly, eyes meeting his without hesitation. Behind him came Special Agent Sarah Whitman. Sarah Whitman was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with straight dark brown hair pulled into a low bun that exposed a composed, unadorned face. Her skin was pale from long winters and longer hours indoors. Her eyes a muted green that missed nothing. She wore a dark wool coat over a simple suit, practical shoes, no jewelry. Everything about her suggested efficiency rather than intimidation. She moved with control, not urgency, as if she understood that pressure applied too early could break the wrong things. Max lifted his head when she entered, eyes following her movements. Sarah noticed immediately. She crouched slightly, keeping distance, hands visible. "He's old," she said quietly, not as an observation but a recognition. "Yes," Robert replied, "but he's still working." Sarah nodded once. Respect registered. The basement was examined carefully. Photographs taken, measurements recorded. The wall opened fully, revealing the containers and the remains with a reverence that surprised Robert. No one rushed. No one treated it like a discovery to be claimed. It was treated like a wrong that needed closing. When Sarah asked Robert to recount the discovery, he did so plainly. No embellishment, no minimization. Helen Carter arrived later, standing off to the side, arms folded, her presence steady. She spoke only when asked, confirming Robert's account, adding nothing unnecessary. By afternoon, the house no longer belonged to Robert in the way it had the day before. It had become a site, a question, a memory being reopened. That night, Sarah returned alone. The official work was paused, but the human part of the conversation remained. "You understand," she said, sitting across from Robert at the kitchen table, "that the contents found in your basement could be worth a great deal of money." Robert said nothing. "It would not be unusual," she continued, voice even, "for someone in your position to delay reporting, to justify it, especially given your age, your dog's condition, the state of the house." Max shifted, his breathing shallow, joints stiff from the cold day. Robert rested a hand along his back, feeling the slow rhythm of life beneath fur and bone. "I understand what you're asking," Robert said, "and I understand why." Sarah watched him closely. She had interviewed many people who had found reasons to keep what was not theirs. She had also seen what those reasons eventually did to them. "Then you know," she said, "that once this process finishes, there may be no reward, no compensation, only disruption." Robert met her gaze. "I didn't come home to profit from someone else's death." Sarah exhaled slowly. Something softened in her expression. Not relief, but recognition. She closed her notebook. "You'd be surprised how rare that answer is," she said. Within days, the investigation confirmed what the containers held. Gold, raw and unrefined, stolen during an armored transport robbery in the early 1980s. The remains belonged to a security guard who had vanished without a trace. A case reopened after 4 decades because a man had chosen not to look away. During the weeks that followed, Robert and Max stayed at the church. The space was warm but impersonal, cots lined neatly along one wall, donated blankets folded with care. Volunteers came and went. Some recognized Robert as a veteran and nodded respectfully. Others left him alone. Both were acceptable. Max's condition worsened in the cold. His back legs shook more often now. His appetite faded. Robert slept little, sitting on the edge of the cot, massaging the dog's hips with slow, practiced movements, whispering old commands, not as orders, but as reassurance. "Stay. Easy. Good boy." Helen visited often, bringing soup, extra blankets, and silence. She never asked if Robert regretted his choice. She already knew the answer. One evening, Sarah returned to the church. She stood near the doorway, coat still on, the cold clinging to her. "I wanted you to hear this directly," she said. "The company that owned the gold has been notified. They've expressed interest in meeting you once the legal process concludes." Robert looked at her steadily. "I don't want anything from them." Sarah nodded. "I expected you'd say that, but they may insist on acknowledging your cooperation. That decision won't be mine." Robert glanced down at Max, who slept now, chest rising unevenly. "Whatever comes," he said, "I'll deal with it clean." Sarah extended her hand. Robert shook it, firm and brief. As she left, Robert felt the weight of the last weeks settle differently. Not lighter, clearer. The choice had been made. The path was narrow, but it was straight. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen street. Inside the church, the lights dimmed for the night. Robert stayed awake, listening to Max breathe, knowing that some battles were not fought to be won, but to be faced. The paperwork took longer than Robert expected. Not because anyone was trying to delay it, but because old crimes moved at the pace of memory, not urgency. Statements were taken, signatures collected, evidence cataloged and reburied in archives that smelled faintly of dust and cold metal. When it was finally over, there was no announcement, no ceremony. Just a phone call on a gray afternoon telling Robert Miller that the case had been formally closed. The family of the dead man had been notified. After more than 40 years of unanswered questions, they now knew where he had gone and how his life had ended. Robert did not attend the burial. He sent a short handwritten note instead, written in careful block letters, expressing regret for a loss he had not caused, but could not ignore. That felt right to him. Presence was not always required for respect. Several weeks later, Robert was asked to meet with a representative of the mining company that had once owned the stolen gold. The meeting took place in a modest office downtown, nothing polished or theatrical. The man who greeted him was named Thomas Keegan, late 50s, tall but slightly stooped, with thinning gray hair and a face that carried the fatigue of someone who had spent years answering for other people's mistakes. Keegan wore a plain suit, no tie, his manner formal but sincere. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. Keegan explained that the company, after consultation with legal counsel, intended to issue a modest finder's compensation to Robert. Not a reward, he emphasized, but an acknowledgement of cooperation and integrity. The amount was enough to cover essential repairs on the house and veterinary care for Max. Nothing more. Robert listened without interrupting. When Keegan finished, Robert nodded once. "That's acceptable," he said. He did not say thank you. He did not refuse either. He understood the difference between greed and sufficiency. By early spring, the house on Maple Street began to change. The roof was replaced section by section, old shingles stripped away to reveal wood that had survived longer than anyone expected. A new heating system was installed, its steady hum a quiet reassurance against the lake wind. The basement stairs were rebuilt, each step solid, no longer creaking under weight. Robert worked alongside the contractors whenever possible, hands moving with familiarity, muscles remembering useful labor. Helen Carter was there often. She arrived with groceries, cleaning supplies, sometimes nothing at all but time. She wore her usual practical clothes, hair pulled back, face open and unguarded in the quiet of the house. She cooked simple meals, soups, and stews that warmed the air. She talked about the veterans she still helped through the church, men and women older than herself, some angry, some lost, some simply tired. Robert listened. He did not offer solutions. He knew better than that. Max spent most of his days near the front window, now watching the street as if guarding it. His body had grown thinner, his movements slower. The tremor in his back legs no longer came only from the cold. Robert noticed everything. He adjusted their walks, shorter routes, slower pace. At night, Max slept closer to Robert's chair, breathing heavy but calm. The next winter came early and harsh. Snow piled higher than the year before, and the cold settled deep into bones and joints. Max struggled more with each passing week. His appetite faded, and his once alert ears drooped permanently now. Robert took him to the veterinarian as often as needed, sitting quietly during examinations, absorbing information without argument. Age, arthritis, heart strain. There were limits even discipline could not push past. One morning, before dawn, Robert woke to an unfamiliar stillness. The house was warm, the heater working perfectly, but something was wrong. Max lay on his side near the chair, eyes open but unfocused, chest barely rising. Robert knelt beside him immediately, placing a hand on the dog's ribs, feeling the shallow rhythm slow beneath his palm. Helen arrived within minutes of the call. She stood just inside the doorway, coat still on, her face composed but her eyes soft. She did not speak. She did not need to. Robert sat on the floor beside Max, one hand resting on the dog's neck, the other supporting his chest. He spoke quietly, not to anyone else in the room. He told Max he was home. He told him he had done well. He told him it was all right to stop. Max's breathing eased once, then again, and then did not return. There was no struggle, no sound, just a release so gentle it felt like permission. Robert stayed where he was for a long time after. Helen remained at the door, giving space, understanding that some moments did not belong to witnesses. When Robert finally stood, his movements were careful, precise, as if he were carrying something fragile inside himself. They buried Max later that day beneath a tall pine at the edge of the yard, where the snow thinned first in spring. Robert marked the place with a simple wooden post. No name, no dates. He did not need reminders. That night, the house was silent in a way it had not been before. Not empty, just finished. Robert sat alone at the table, the weight of the past year settling into something quieter. The crime was closed. The house was repaired. The companion who had walked beside him for years was gone. There was grief, but it was clean. No regret clung to it. Robert understood then that some endings were not punishments. They were conclusions earned through honesty. Outside, snow fell softly, covering the ground once more. Inside, the lights stayed on. Winter returned the following year with a quieter authority. The storms were fewer, the cold still sharp, but the house on Maple Street no longer felt hollow when the wind pressed against it. The warmth inside came less from the furnace and more from the steady rhythm of people moving through. Boots by the door, voices low and familiar, the sound of life continuing. Robert Miller rose early each morning. He always had. The habit survived wars, loss, and retirement. He brewed coffee before sunrise, standing by the kitchen window as snow drifted down in slow, patient sheets. On the living room wall hung a framed photograph of Max, taken years earlier on a clear autumn day. The dog standing alert beside him, ears lifted, eyes steady. Robert did not speak to the photograph. He did not need to. Presence was enough. Helen Carter arrived most days just after 8. She knocked once, lightly, then entered, shedding her coat near the door. At 55, Helen moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned how to be useful without demanding attention. Her hair was shorter now, cut just above the shoulders, streaked with gray she did not bother to hide. Her face had softened over the years, not weakened, shaped by patience and a deliberate refusal to harden. She brought lists, phone numbers, and the unspoken expectation that work still mattered. Together, Robert and Helen began helping the veterans in their small neighborhood. There was no formal organization, no name on a sign. Word traveled the old way. A roof that leaked. A ride needed to the clinic. A man who had not spoken to anyone in weeks. One of the first they helped was Frank Lawson, a former Navy mechanic in his early 70s. Frank was stocky, shoulders rounded from years bent over engines, his hands permanently stained despite retirement. He wore his gray hair long and uncombed, his beard uneven, eyes sharp but wary. Frank had learned to distrust help after a string of disappointments. Robert did not offer sympathy. He offered labor. Together they replaced a section of damaged siding, working in silence until Frank began to talk on his own terms. Another was Maria Alvarez, a petite woman in her late 60s who had served as an army nurse. Her posture was straight despite a slight limp from an old injury. Her dark hair kept neatly cropped, her skin weathered by both sun and time. Maria spoke gently but directly, the way medical professionals often do when truth matters more than comfort. She did not need repairs. She needed company. Helen sat with her for hours, listening, letting stories unfold without correction. As the weeks passed, the house became a meeting point. Coffee cups lined the counter, boots dried by the heater. Laughter appeared, tentative at first, then easier. No one spoke of medals or ranks. No one asked for proof. Service was assumed, and so was survival. Robert found that his grief shifted shape. The quiet evenings without Max were still heavy, but the weight no longer pressed inward. It spread outward, connecting him to others who understood the cost of loyalty and time. When he walked alone now, he did so with purpose rather than habit. One afternoon, Sarah Whitman stopped by. She arrived without announcement, coat buttoned against the cold, her dark hair still pulled back in its usual restrained style. The month since the investigation had softened her expression slightly. Not less focused, but less guarded. She stood in the doorway, observing the scene with a professional's eye and a citizen's curiosity. "You built something here," she said. Robert shrugged. "We're just keeping things from falling apart." Sarah smiled faintly. She noticed the photo of Max, the worn furniture, the coffee cups still warm. She stayed only a few minutes, long enough to confirm that no further legal matters remained, long enough to say what she had come to say. "You made it easier for a lot of people," she said quietly. "Not just the family from the case." Robert nodded. Praise made him uncomfortable. Acknowledgement did not. As winter deepened, Helen and Robert organized a weekly supper at the church. Nothing elaborate. Soup, bread, coffee, chairs arranged in a circle rather than rows. They listened more than they spoke. Some nights no one came. Other nights the room filled. Both were acceptable. One evening, a young man named Thomas Reed attended for the first time. He was in his early 40s, tall and thin, with close-cut hair and a face drawn tight by exhaustion rather than age. His hands shook slightly when he accepted a cup of coffee. He had served overseas, come home, lost his job, and then his bearings. Robert did not question him. He simply pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "You don't have to explain," Robert said. "You just have to stay." Thomas nodded, eyes down, shoulders loosening a fraction. The house on Maple Street remained modest. There were no renovations beyond what was necessary, no sense of arrival. That was never the point. What had once been a place that held a buried crime had become something else entirely. A place where the past was acknowledged without being worshipped, where the present was worked on carefully, where the future was approached without illusion. On a clear morning near the end of winter, Robert stood outside beneath the pine where Max was buried. Snow had melted around the base of the tree, exposing dark earth. Robert rested his gloved hand against the trunk, breathing slowly. "We're all right," he said quietly. Not to the ground, to the moment. Inside, the house waited, not empty, not silent, simply ready. Robert returned indoors, hung his coat, and poured another cup of coffee. Voices drifted in from the living room. Helen was already there, speaking softly with someone new, her tone steady and welcoming. War had ended long ago. What remained was responsibility, community, the simple, stubborn decision to stay present. And that, Robert understood now, was enough. Sometimes the miracle is not a sudden rescue, not gold hidden in a wall, and not a life changed overnight. Sometimes the miracle is quieter. It is the strength to choose what is right when no one is watching. It is the courage to let go of what does not belong to us. It is the grace to keep showing up, even after loss. The Bible reminds us that God works in ways we do not always understand. Not every blessing arrives as comfort. Some arrive as responsibility. Some arrive as a test of the heart. In our everyday lives, we may never face a hidden crime or a moment as heavy as Robert's. But we all face choices. Choices to be kind when we are tired. Choices to tell the truth when silence would be easier. Choices to care for others when we ourselves are carrying quiet wounds. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, or share a memory of someone who taught you integrity through their actions, not their words. And if you find comfort in stories of faith, courage, and quiet redemption, consider subscribing to our channel so we can continue walking this journey together. May God bless you and keep you. May He give you peace in your home, strength in your choices, and light on your path. And may the quiet miracles of everyday life remind you that you are never walking alone.